Hi everybody, welcome to this video on how to fly and navigate with VORs. So I'm not a real life pilot and I think that should be a very clear disclaimer here. I wish I were, but I'm not, so hey, I gotta deal with what I have, which is a great flight simulator, which is loads of fun. With this I mean, please do not use this video if you're flying in real life or if you're practicing and studying to become a real life pilot. I think these are going to be very easy and handy tips if you want to have fun in Flight Simulator and understand the core concepts behind VORs, but nothing more than that. So let's get to it. What is a VOR? A VOR is a device which sits on the ground, so you'll have plenty of VOR devices scattered throughout the whole world wherever people fly. And these devices, they emit, let's say, 360 virtual lines. Now these will be the radials, and you will have one radial per degree out of the 360 degrees, making the full circle around the VOR. You tune into a VOR's frequency with your radio. Next to every chart where you have a VOR indicated, you will have its frequency, the name, and the Morse code. So the first thing you want to do to fly a VOR is get its frequency. We're very close to a VOR called Goodwood in South UK. And Goodwood's VOR, which is represented by that upward pointing arrow or triangle at GWC, has a frequency of 114.75. So the first thing you want to do is get that frequency into your nav1 on the radios. You can do this in Flight Simulator by dialing this frequency into the standby 114.75. And as I do this and make this frequency active, you will notice immediately that the navigation system picks up GWC Goodwood VOR, and it also tells me the distance that I am from the VOR. So this is a VOR with DME capabilities. DME means it is also able to measure your distance to the VOR. Radials are always outbound from a VOR. So let's focus GWC here, and if you imagine a circle around GWC with 360 small lines emanating from the VOR, those will be the radials, and they always go from the VOR to the outside. If somebody were to tell me now, fly to Goodwood VOR on radial 10, what would I have to do? The first thing is dial in the frequency, and that has been done, and then we will tell the plane to assist me in flying radial 10 with this instrument here called the CDI, Course Deviation Indicator. And the first thing you are going to do is dial in radial 10. To do this, you rotate the OBS knob, which is the Omni Bearing Selector knob, until you get 10 aligned with the topmost yellow arrow. And that's it. This means that I now have my instruments all set up to fly radial 10 of the Goodwood VOR. As I mentioned just now, every radial is a virtual line out of 360 which emanate from the VOR. The VOR's north points to the Earth's magnetic north, which means that radial 10 is 10 degrees offset to the right from the north. We're currently flying southbound. That means we are flying away from radial 10. And that means that flying radial 10 will take us from south to north, and thus flying to the VOR. Because again, we are south of the VOR, and we are now setting ourselves up to fly towards a radial which emanates from the VOR to the north. And you can also see this here in the CDI represented by this 2 arrow. And that also means that if we add 180 degrees to the radial 10, that means we will be setting ourselves up to fly radial 190, which will be emanating from the VOR and southwards, and thus from the VOR. So if we rotate this knob here to radial 190, the arrow now points from, and it makes sense. So let's get our radial back to 10. So while that's all fun and games and we're setting things up, we're still not flying towards the VOR. So what's left to do? Well, for starters, let's start heading back north because we know that we are tracking southwards from the VOR and that's not what we want. We're currently set up to fly heading 140 roughly, so let's just fly back northwards for now and let's see what happens. Now that we're heading northwards again, if we look at the GPS, if we follow this flight path, we're not going to fly above the Goodwood VOR. We're going to pass just southwest a bit. However, we have our CDI to help me. What is our CDI now telling us? The CDI is telling us that the radial 10, which will, as we mentioned before, emanate from the VOR and northwards, 10 degrees offset to the right, is a vector that we can intercept at a certain point, and that vector is to our left. And this is indicated by the white vertical bar here, which is to our left. If you draw an imaginary line from Goodwood, actually pointing 10 degrees offset to the right of the magnetic north, and if you extend that line southwards of the VOR, that line will be exactly the vector that the CDI will assist us in following. As we get closer and closer to that line, this vertical white line will start getting closer and closer to the center of the CDI. When you're flying a radial perfectly center, then this vertical bar will be exactly on the center of your CDI. And as we're flying along the beautiful southern coast of England, we're flying southbound of the VOR, and you can see that the white vertical needle is now approaching the center, which means that we are getting very, very close of intercepting the radial. So we should now start turning right to intercept this radial. So let's head on and turn right. We're now turning right and heading 010, which is parallel to the heading of the radial we want to fly. But our radial is still to our left, which means we need to adjust. If we aim to the left, we're going to be flying closer and closer to the radial and closing the distance between us and the radial. So let's do just that and monitor to see what happens. Since we are very close to the radial, we do not need to aim too much to the left. We're getting very close to the radial, and as it becomes centered, we can now aim at heading 10 again. And we should now be on track on the radial. As you get closer to the VOR, it is expected that this vertical bar starts to become more unstable, and thus requiring more and more corrections to keep centered. This is expectable. As you get closer to the VOR, the sensitivity becomes higher as well. We're now 2 nautical miles from the VOR, and we are very close to being centered with the radial. As we get closer to the VOR, and as I mentioned before, this vertical bar will start to move further and further away from the center. I don't think it's worth it to adjust anymore, as we'll constantly need to adjust to keep it centered at this point. So let's just fly and see what happens for the next 1 nautical mile. This is a clear indicator to look out for when flying VOR. If you start to see very, very sudden deviation from the radial, chances are you are very, very close to flying on top of the VOR. And there we go. As we approach the VOR, the vertical bar completely moved to the right. So we're now flying on top of the VOR, and we are in the cone of silence, and not anymore. It captured the signal again, but if you look now, the arrow says from, because we are now flying from the VOR and no longer to the VOR. And again, it knows this because we are on radial 10 and northbound of the VOR. And again, radials emanate from the VOR and not towards. So radial 10 is always going to be from the VOR when you are northbound from the VOR. As we get further and further away from the VOR, the radial sensitivity decreases, and again, the vertical bar comes closer and closer to the center, and it will tend to become perfectly centered as we get further away. Great, and now that you know how to fly using the assistance of VORs, how would we do to go from Goodwood to Southampton to land south to north? We know that we're just now north of Goodwood, and we know that Southampton is here to our left, where it says EGHI. And we also know that we can use VORs to help us navigate. You can get your visual references from a map, SkyVector, or the very GPS here in this Garmin panel. So, to go west, we can take radial 270 from Goodwood. Again, and to remember, if you draw a virtual circle around Goodwood, radial 0 will point to the Earth's magnetic north. So radial 270 will emanate from the VOR station and westward. So let's tune in the system for this. We are connected to the Goodwood VOR, but we want to flick our CDI to radial 270, which is fully on west. And now we fly towards this radial. As we can see from the CDI, it is to our left. So now we turn left towards the radial. As we know from checking the map that this radial will fly westward from the VOR, and we're still northbound from the VOR, we need to point our plane southwest from where we are to intercept this radial. Heading 210 should be good enough for that, so let's aim for that. This aircraft is also equipped with a secondary navigation device, this smaller Garmin panel here. So I've also tuned in the Southampton VOR 113.35 on the active navigation frequency of this secondary navigation device. This device will not interact with the main CDI on top, but it will interact with the secondary CDI here on the bottom, which does not look as fancy nor as informative as the one on top, but it is pretty good to help us get our bearings as well and to prepare for when we move Southampton's VOR into the main one. We know that we want to land on runway 02 at Southampton, so that means we can also fly on course 020 on the Southampton VOR. That will bring us very close and parallel to the runway. You can see that we're getting very close to the radial, so we're going to start turning westwards. Unlike previously, our distance from the Goodwood VOR is increasing because we are flying from the VOR, as the CDI also illustrates. We know that we're going to be landing south to north at Southampton, and we're currently flying west, which means that to aim at north, we're going to need to perform a right turn to align ourselves both with the runway and with Southampton's VOR on course 020. We also know that we have our autopilot set to fly westwards, and we are centered with the radial, so we're not going to veer off of it too much. So we can now get Southampton's VOR onto our main CDI by getting its frequency 113.35 as the active frequency on nav1. And there we go. It's now tuned into that VOR. So we're going to dial in our course of 020, and we're now all set to fly radial 20 onto Southampton's VOR. In case we want to keep reference of the Goodwood VOR and make sure we are on the radial, we can tune into the Goodwood VOR on our secondary navigation device on 114.75, and we can also point it westwards, which is radial 270, which is where we're flying. And as you can see, it's pretty much centered, so we're good. And we're coming up to the radial, so we can now prepare ourselves to turn right heading 020 to fly the radial. So I'm going to dial in heading 020 on the autopilot. And let's see how the plane handles this and if we're spot on the radial or if we need to make any further adjustment. You can see Southampton down below. And we're very well on the radial. We have the runway down there, but we are very high. I'm at 3,000 feet, so I'm just going to fly on this radial, and after I cross the VOR, I'm going to start my pattern for landing. We're 2 nautical miles away from the VOR. I'm already descending to 1,000 feet, and then I will execute a left pattern to land on runway 20 at Southampton. So by now you should be able to navigate with VORs in the game, and that should be able to get you from one point to another. If you look at the map and you find VORs, you'll know how to intersect them and fly them. But also if you see a VOR on an instrument approach, you will know exactly how to fly into it or out from it. So thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more, hit the like button if you liked, and just drop something on the comments box if you have any question. If you know better and would like to educate me on something and help me improve my understanding, then please do so as well. I'd be very, very thankful. Thank you so much. Goodbye.